The Cold War was never just a standoff between two superpowers. It was a silent battlefield where every whisper, every coded message, every shadow on a street corner could shift the balance of global power. Behind the headlines, far from diplomatic speeches and public promises, the real struggle played out in the invisible world of intelligence. And it was there, in the clash between the KGB and the CIA, that history almost took a very different turn. This story begins in the late 1970s, at a moment when tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were rising again. Satellites were watching the skies. Nuclear submarines patrolled the oceans. Politicians on both sides spoke of peace. But behind closed doors, generals prepared for the unthinkable. And in the middle of this quiet storm, one man held a secret that could have altered everything. His name was Oleg Sharov, a mid-level KGB officer responsible for analyzing intercepted American communications. Not a spy with a gun, not a legend of field operations, but a quiet analyst with access to information no one outside the Lubyanka building had ever seen. Sharov didn't drink, didn't smoke, and avoided political conversations. To his colleagues, he was invisible. But invisibility is the perfect armor for a spy, or for someone who might become one. One evening in 1978, Sharov discovered something unusual, a pattern hidden among routine American diplomatic cables. It hinted at a classified CIA operation underway somewhere in Eastern Europe, an operation targeting a Soviet research facility tied to early nuclear tracking systems. If successful, it would give the CIA an unprecedented advantage: the ability to monitor Soviet missile launches in real time. Sharov understood instantly what this meant. If the Americans gained such an advantage, the balance of fear, the very foundation of the Cold War, would crumble. One side would no longer fear the other. And when fear disappears, real war becomes possible. For several nights he didn't sleep, replaying the intercepted codes again and again. The pieces fit too perfectly to ignore. Someone inside the USSR, someone highly placed, was feeding the CIA detailed logistical data about the facility. A mole. And not just any mole, someone who had access to top-secret military routes. Sharov made his report, and that report set off a chain reaction he could never have predicted. Within days, a special KGB unit was quietly formed to identify the source of the leak. They gave the investigation a code name: Operacja Tenevaya Stena, Operation Shadow Wall. The CIA's plan wasn't just dangerous. It was brilliant. They had hidden their agents so deeply that even the KGB didn't know where to begin. What Sharov didn't know, what no one in Moscow knew, was that the CIA was already in motion. A field operative had crossed a border the night before. A meeting was scheduled. A message was about to be delivered. And if everything went according to plan, the Americans would soon hold the most powerful intelligence advantage of the entire Cold War. But the Cold War rarely went according to plan. The secret KGB task force assembled in a windowless briefing room deep beneath Lubyanka. No records, no official files, no trace that the group even existed. Their assignment was simple in words but nearly impossible in execution. Find the unknown mole who was feeding the CIA information about the Soviet nuclear tracking project. At the center of the room stood Colonel Viktor Malenkov, a man whose reputation inside the KGB was whispered rather than spoken aloud. He wasn't the loudest, nor the most decorated, but he had a talent feared by every operative. He noticed everything. One misplaced comma in a report, a slight hesitation in a witness, a shadow where none should be. Malenkov saw patterns long before others even realized something was wrong. He began the briefing with a single sentence: "The Americans are closer than we think." Files were passed around the table, each marked "Совершенно секретно," top secret. Inside were copies of intercepted messages Sharov had uncovered, maps of the research facility, and lists of personnel with access to restricted routes. The room was silent except for the slow turning of pages. Malenkov pointed at the map. "This facility," he said, tapping his finger, "monitors early-stage missile activity. If the CIA gains access to this data, our nuclear shield becomes transparent." The implications didn't need further explanation. A transparent shield meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant pressure. Pressure meant concessions, or war. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away in East Germany, the CIA's operative, known only by his code name, Harbor, walked calmly down a quiet street in Leipzig. He wore an expression so ordinary it was almost forgettable. That was his strength. Harbor specialized in blending in, neutral clothing, average posture, a face that invited no questions. He checked his watch. The meeting was in 28 minutes. The contact he was about to meet was the CIA's most valuable asset inside the Soviet system. No one in Langley knew his real name. only his coded identifier. Vega. What Vega was passing to the CIA wasn't just data. It was the roadmap to the internal Soviet transport network, connected to the nuclear tracking project. If Harbor got the information out safely, the CIA's advantage would be immediate. But Harbor sensed something unusual today. A tension in the air. Two men who seemed to be standing at the same corner longer than they needed. A car that slowed down just slightly when he passed. Nothing obvious, nothing provable. But in espionage, the smallest irregularity could mean the difference between a successful extraction and a shallow grave. Back in Moscow, Sharov, the analyst who started all of this, was beginning to worry. He had never intended to become part of an active investigation. Analysts worked with paper, not people. They observed from a distance. They didn't participate in hunts for traitors. But Malenkov insisted Sharov join the task force. "You saw what others did not," Malenkov said. "We need your mind." Sharov tried to calm himself as he reviewed personnel assignments. 9 people had the necessary clearance, 9 possible suspects, but one name stood out. A logistics officer who had recently requested transfers between multiple regions, transfers that matched the timing of Vega's leaks almost perfectly. His name, Major Leonid Primakov, a respected officer, a family man, someone who had never once drawn suspicion. Sharov hesitated. If Primakov really was the mole, the CIA had infiltrated far deeper than anyone imagined. As he prepared his notes, an urgent message arrived for Malenkov. The colonel read it, his expression hardening. "Comrade Sharov," he said quietly, "we have confirmation. A CIA operative has crossed into East Germany in the last 24 hours. Their meeting is imminent." Sharov felt the weight of the moment. Everything he had feared was now unfolding. Malenkov continued, "We cannot allow this exchange to happen. If the Americans secure Vega's information, it will shift the balance of the Cold War." He looked Sharov directly in the eyes. "Pack your things. You're coming with us." The hunt was no longer theoretical. The players were already moving, and somewhere in Leipzig, Harbor was about to discover that the KGB was closer than he ever expected. Leipzig was a city that never truly slept, yet never truly woke. Even in the late 1970s, it carried the muted heaviness of life under East German surveillance. People walked with lowered eyes, conversations were short, and every window felt as if someone behind it might be listening. For a CIA operative, it was the perfect place for a meeting, and the worst. Harbor arrived at the rendezvous point, a modest bookstore near the city center. The sign above the door flickered weakly, casting a pale glow over the entrance. This shop served as a cover for dozens of micro-meetings between East and West. Its owner, an elderly man with thick glasses, had no idea he was at the center of a silent conflict. Harbor nodded to him as he entered, then moved quietly toward the back. A narrow aisle led to a small reading corner, 2 chairs, a lamp, and a stack of dusty magazines. Harbor sat down, removed his coat, and pretended to read. Every 30 seconds he glanced at the doorway. Vega was late. 5 minutes late wasn't unusual. 10 minutes wasn't ideal. 15 meant trouble. Harbor checked his watch again. He felt the tension tighten in his chest. He replayed the walk from his hotel, picturing each street he crossed. Had he been followed? Had someone picked up his trail? Nothing obvious, but he couldn't shake the feeling that invisible eyes were tracking him. Finally, at 16 minutes past the scheduled time, Vega entered. He looked older than Harbor expected, thin, with graying hair and a posture made humble by years of duty. His expression was composed but strained, like a man carrying too much information in his head and too much fear in his heart. He approached the reading corner but didn't sit. Instead, he whispered, barely moving his lips, "We don't have much time." Harbor closed his magazine and stood slightly, shielding Vega from the front window. "Were you followed?" Harbor asked. "I don't know," Vega replied. "But something changed in the last 48 hours. My supervisor is asking questions, and I think the KGB has narrowed the leak to our department." Harbor felt his pulse quicken. The CIA had suspected this risk, but they hoped the Soviets were still far from identifying their mole. They were wrong. Vega glanced toward the door. "I brought what I could. It's incomplete, but it's enough." He slipped a small, thin envelope from inside his coat. Harbor reached for it, but Vega didn't release it immediately. His voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "If they catch me, tell them I did this for balance, not betrayal." Harbor looked at the man for a moment, not as an asset, but as a human being caught between two superpowers that saw individuals only as pieces on a board. "You did the right thing," Harbor said quietly. Finally, Vega let go. Harbor slipped the envelope into the lining of his jacket. But before he could say anything more, Vega tensed. His eyes locked on something behind Harbor, a shadow at the front of the store. Then another. 2 men entered, pretending to browse. They wore civilian clothes, ordinary coats, plain shoes, but their posture betrayed them. Shoulders too straight, movements too controlled. Vega whispered through gritted teeth. KGB. Harbor didn't look directly at the men. He didn't need to. He had seen enough field agents to recognize the predatory stillness in their movements. One of the KGB officers drifted toward the counter, pretending to ask the shopkeeper about a book. The second slowly walked down the right aisle, stopping every few steps as if browsing. But he wasn't browsing. He was listening. Harbor's mind raced. The exit was blocked. The back door was locked from the inside. Only employees had the key. If they stayed still, suspicion would rise. If they moved too quickly, they would be exposed. Vega wiped sweat from his forehead. "We must leave separately," he whispered. "If we leave together, they'll take us both." "That's not an option," Harbor replied. "They'll interrogate me. I won't survive that. You know this." Harbor did, and yet leaving Vega behind went against every instinct he had. Then Harbor noticed something. A delivery entrance in the back, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. If they could reach it, they might slip out into the narrow alley behind the shop. But there was no time to plan. The KGB officer in the right aisle turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at them. Harbor made his decision. He whispered, "When I get up, follow 3 seconds later." Vega's eyes widened with fear, but he nodded. Harbor stood, stretching casually, as if bored with his magazine. The officer watched him. Harbor walked slowly toward the back of the shop. 3 seconds later, Vega rose. Not casually, nervously, and that was enough. The KGB officer began to move. Harbor saw it in his peripheral vision. The chase was about to begin. Harbor moved quickly but without panic, weaving between shelves toward the back of the bookstore. He didn't dare look behind him. Any sign of fear would confirm suspicion. But he could feel it. The shift in energy. The way the room suddenly tightened like a spring being wound. Vega followed several steps behind, trying to appear calm. But his rigid posture betrayed him. And that was all the KGB officer needed. Footsteps, quickened, purposeful. Harbor reached the stack of boxes concealing the delivery entrance. He slipped behind them, pretending to examine a book that wasn't even in his hands. He needed seconds, just seconds, for Vega to catch up. But Vega didn't get those seconds. The KGB officer in the aisle called out sharply in German. "Halt, ein Moment!" Stop, 1 moment. The tone wasn't polite. It was a command. Harbor's heartbeat spiked. He glimpsed Vega's terrified eyes as the man froze, caught between flight and obedience. The second KGB officer approached from the front of the shop. They were surrounding Vega. Harbor knew exactly what would happen next. A voluntary conversation, a forced escort to a waiting car, then a basement room where truth was extracted drop by drop. Harbor couldn't let that happen. He acted. With a single motion, he shoved the stack of boxes sideways. They toppled onto the floor with a deafening crash, scattering paper and debris. The distraction was enough. Both officers snapped their attention to the noise. Harbor didn't hesitate. He grabbed Vega's arm and yanked him behind the shelves toward the delivery door. The shopkeeper shouted in confusion. Books tumbled. The KGB officers shouted orders. Harbor kicked the metal-barred door. It didn't budge. He kicked again, harder. The thin wood splintered just enough for the latch to loosen. He pushed his shoulder into it. It cracked open, revealing a narrow alley behind the store. Cold air rushed in. "Move!" Harbor hissed. They stumbled out into the alley. Just as the first KGB officer lunged around the corner, a hand reached through the gap in the broken door, grabbing Vega's coat. Harbor spun, slammed his body into the door, and forced it shut. The officer's hand slipped away. Harbor jammed a loose broom handle through the metal bracket to barricade it. It would buy them maybe 30 seconds. Maybe. Vega panted heavily. They know who I am." "Not yet," Harbor said. "But they will in minutes unless we keep moving." They sprinted down the alley. It was a long, narrow corridor squeezed between 2 old buildings. The ground was uneven, and puddles splashed beneath their feet. At the end of the alley was a busy street, a chance to disappear if they played it right. Harbor grabbed Vega's shoulder. "When we reach the street, walk. Don't run, blend in. You're just another citizen. And you? I'll take a different direction. We regroup at the secondary point." Vega nodded, though his eyes were filled with dread. They reached the end of the alley and froze. A black Volga sedan rolled slowly past the intersection. A car that did not belong in East Germany. A Soviet vehicle, KGB. "They're coordinating already," Vega whispered. Harbor cursed under his breath. The car passed, but it meant one thing: the net was closing faster than expected. He scanned the street. Pedestrians, bicycles, a tram approaching from the distance. They needed chaos, something to disrupt the KGB's visual lock. Harbor pulled a small metal object from his pocket and flicked it toward a nearby trash bin. A second later, a sharp bang. Smoke billowed. Not an explosion, but a diversion charge. Enough to make people turn. Shout, scatter. Now, Harbor ordered. They stepped into the chaos, walking briskly but not running. People rushed past them, coughing from the smoke. A cyclist swerved, shouting. Someone yelled for help. Harbor used the moment to put distance between himself and Vega. The plan was simple. Split up, reduce the risk that both would be taken. But Vega hesitated. Harbor, if I'm caught. You won't be, Harbor said. Just follow the plan. They separated. Harbor turned left toward the tram stop. Vega turned right into a crowd emerging from a bakery. For a moment, it looked like everything might actually work. Then the alley door behind them exploded open. The KGB officers barreled out shouting. They saw Vega. Harbor spun, eyes locking with Vega's across the street. The terror on Vega's face said everything. The officers charged after him. Harbor reached for the envelope inside his jacket, the one holding Vega's intelligence. It suddenly felt unbearably heavy. Vega had risked everything for the balance of power. And now he was about to be swallowed by the machine he chose to betray. Harbor took a single step toward him, then another. He knew he shouldn't. He knew the mission required him to escape. But the thought of Vega being dragged into a basement room, alone, made him move faster. And then Vega did something Harbor didn't expect. He looked back, not at the KGB officers, at Harbor, and he mouthed two words. Keep running. Before Harbor could react, Vega shoved through a crowd of pedestrians, knocking over a table of fruit and scattering apples across the pavement. The officers followed. The chase continued. But this time, Harbor wasn't part of it. He watched Vega disappear into the maze of Leipzig streets, knowing deep down that the next time he saw the man might be in a report marked deceased. Harbor stood motionless for a moment, torn between instinct and duty. Vega had disappeared into the twisting streets of Leipzig. Chased by two relentless KGB operatives, the city noise swallowed. The shouts and footsteps until all that remained was the faint bell of the approaching tram. His training screamed at him, "Leave, now." Vega's final words echoed even louder, "Keep running." So Harbor did. He boarded the tram just as its doors were closing. The dingy interior smelled of old metal and damp coats. Passengers looked tired, drained by daily life behind the Iron Curtain. No one noticed the American operative slipping into a corner seat. Harbor stared out the window as the tram pulled away. The crowd where Vega had vanished grew smaller, then blurred, then disappeared entirely. Whatever happened next, Vega was on his own. Back in Moscow, inside Lubyanka, Colonel Malenkov paced the length of a dimly lit war room. A map of Leipzig lay across the table, marked with hurried pencil lines. Agents moved in and out, relaying updates from East Germany. Sharov sat quietly in the corner, listening to every report with growing dread. Finally, an officer rushed in holding a coded message on thin yellow paper. Malenkov read it quickly, then again, slower. "Report," Sharov pressed, unable to hide the anxiety in his voice. Malenkov exhaled. The operative escaped. The mole fled on foot. Status unknown. Unknown. The word hit like a hammer. It meant one of two things. Vega was either dead or soon would be. Sharov felt something twist inside him. He had wanted the leak stopped, yes, but not like this. Not with a man hunted through foreign streets. Not with his own discovery setting off a chain that might end in a dark cell. But there was no turning back now. Malenkov placed the message down. "We continue. If Vega is captured alive, he will reveal everything. We must assume the CIA has the information." Sharov nodded, though part of him wished he had never seen those coded patterns at all. The extraction. The tram screeched to a stop near the outskirts of the city. Harbor slipped off, crossed two streets, and entered an abandoned warehouse, the CIA's emergency extraction point. A lone operative from West Berlin was already waiting, concealed in the shadows. "You have the package?" the man asked. Harbor removed the envelope from his jacket. "I do." They opened it under the dim lantern light. Inside were transit routes used by the Soviet nuclear tracking project, shift schedules, structural diagrams, and a single note written in shaky handwriting. "This is the last advantage I can give. Use it to keep the world in balance. Vega." Harbor stared at the words for a long moment. The world outside was split in two: ideologies, armies, borders. But this note made the conflict feel painfully human. The extraction team prepared to leave. Harbor glanced once more toward the city center, toward the path Vega had taken. He whispered, "I'm sorry." Then he boarded the vehicle. Within minutes, they were on their way to West Berlin. The envelope would soon land on the desk of a CIA director who would smile privately. Knowing the intelligence could shift the Cold War's strategic calculations. But no one in Langley would ever know the cost. No one except Harbor. The final report. Weeks later, back in Moscow, Sharov received a classified memo stamped with red ink. Subject, Primakov Leonid. Status, presumed dead. Vega's real name. His fate sealed in a single line. Sharov folded the paper and slid it into a drawer he knew he'd never open again. He had done his job. He had served the state. Yet he felt no victory, only the cold, hollow awareness that the world had come within inches of shifting dramatically. One envelope, one meeting, one frightened man in a bookstore, and history kept moving, unchanged, because one agent vanished into the shadows of Leipzig, never to be seen again. Epilogue. Harbor never returned to East Germany. He never received confirmation of Vega's capture, nor of his escape. But every few years, he would reread the note Vega left. And each time, he felt the same quiet weight. Some operations change history. Others almost do. This was the latter. An invisible battle fought in silence, erased from headlines, forgotten by governments, but remembered by the few who lived it. Two men on opposite sides of a divided world, both believing in their own way that they were fighting for balance. And for a brief moment, the fate of the Cold War rested not on missiles or armies, but on a single envelope, passed between trembling hands in a small bookstore in Leipzig.